All right. Well, welcome to the Business of Speaking show. I am your host, Tim McDonald, and today I am joined by my special guest, Christina Blacken. How are you doing, Christina?
I'm doing good.
Great. Well, I'm so excited to have you here. And for those just tuning in, maybe for the first time, a little bit about this show is not really to focus on what these speakers talk about and share on their stage, but really to learn the journey, how they got to the stage, and what they've learned ever since, and turning it into a business. So it's really geared towards anybody thinking about getting involved in speaking, just getting started speaking, or anywhere along the path, because we all have something to learn from each other. And I'm a big believer in communities. So, with that, Christina, I would love to just kind of hear your story of how did you get started in speaking?
How much time you got?
I got as
Well,
much time as you want until 4 o'clock when I got another show.
so essentially, I have always been a performer. I think of public speaking as performance first. And I remember my first time performing was actually in front of my family when we had gotten this really cute sort of guitar set. And I put an entire show on for my family and was doing these songs and dancing and singing. And from that moment, I always had this compulsion around performance and how powerful it can be to connect with someone and teach them something. So from there, I ended up being part of a Baptist church. It was the same as the church that my grandparents and my mom and a whole bunch of family grew up in. And I remember I gave a sermon as a kid. They used to give us like kid sermons and allow us to get up on the pew and speak the word and move people and motivate and inspire people. So I did that. And I'm no longer in the church anymore. But from there, I really became quite passionate about public speaking when I was in corporate America. And that was just something I did. And I enjoyed it because it was fun. And I was the only person usually on my teams who wanted to do it. So if there was a panel or a conference, I would just volunteer and essentially do presentations. And then from there, I became really passionate about using some of the things that I had picked up from my experiences and teaching them as frameworks and tools, especially around inclusion, especially around narrative intelligence and how it affects our behavior and our beliefs. And I created my own frameworks and started to teach that on the side while I was working full time, probably 4 years ago. And then I became a full time sort of public speaker and trainer within the last year, honestly. So it was a side hustle for many years and something that I did in addition to my job. So I was doing a million things at once for a number of years as I got into speaking.
I love that because it's like I think so many people think you can just hit a button and have it all happen. And hearing how long it took with you working full time was really interesting. I'm kind of curious, even though you really described yourself as a natural performer since a very young age. Was there a difference? Did you feel like the first time outside of a work setting, just doing a work, presentation to when you got up on stage in front of a big group of people, and when you were getting paid for the first time, was there a difference in how you felt?
Oh, for sure. I think before when I was doing public speaking as a corporate representative, so I worked in the law world and marketing and sales, media, and the nonprofit space. So I was in four different industries, and I was always sort of a talking head for that organization. So whatever their frameworks, their ideology was, had to be my own, and I would have my own spin on it, my own point of view. But being in my own public speaking practice and being able to take the frameworks and the ideas that I have solely on my own has been really affirming. It's nice to be able to say, I have these ideas and I think they're impactful and I've done some research and I've done some testing, but then putting it out into the world and seeing how people react to it live is really incredible and really powerful. An example is I did a talk at a human resources conference last year, and I did a talk about imposter syndrome and essentially how narrative can be a powerful tool for impacting limiting beliefs and how you interact with people. And I had so many individuals come up to me after and say, this is the first time I've been able to identify some of my own limiting beliefs. And I literally left feeling like I could become more confident. Like this is practical and actionable and also inspirational. And it was great to have that immediate feedback and to know that something that I developed on my own without somebody else's, hand of approval necessarily was actually seen as useful and valuable. So that was huge for me just to have those ideas affirmed. And being on stage is fun. Like I approach every public speaking as an engagement, almost like a way to showcase a different part of my personality and engage with the audience. And so I love to sing while I present, and I do things that are probably a bit unconventional. And that's just fun to be able to do what I want and not necessarily have it be confined when I was doing public speaking when I was in corporate America.
That's very interesting. I've been fortunate enough to work at a pretty large organization where they didn't mind me going out and speak, and they never told me what I could and couldn't say, but I kind of had that in the back of my mind. You better not say this or you better not say that. So it is kind of that liberating thing of getting out there and doing it. I'm kind of curious when, you're talking about creating the framework and everything. So when you look at your business, is it really just all getting up on stage, or what other elements to your business do you have?
So I would say my business is really in two separate sides because at the core of it is this concept of narrative intelligence, which is around storytelling and narrative and how it affects your behavior. So I teach that as educational workshops to organizations and to individuals. And then I also provide copywriting services and writing for entrepreneurs who are underserved. And that really is just me writing. So I produce things, I give strategic feedback, I consult. So it's really 50-50. I think now because, a lot of what I teach is around inclusion and equity. So that's blowing up for a number of reasons and more people are reaching out. So a lot of my energy and attention is going to that right now. But, before that, it was probably a pretty heavy split down the middle between consulting, one-on-one copywriting services, and also the public speaking.
And was the copywriting part of what you were doing when you were working at other organizations, or was it just something you kind of evolved into when you started doing your thing on the side?
It sort of evolved because the job that I had right before I left on full time was a director of strategy at a media company. And so I was in branded content and doing a lot of writing, a lot of strategy, a lot of creative ideation. And I've always been a writer. I've been writing since I was a kid too. So there's a through line there. I've been doing a lot of these things for a long time. And I just have had a passion for it and I've written a lot of different publications on the side. And so while I was teaching and speaking about storytelling as this powerful tool for behavior change and inclusive leadership, people would just reach out and say, hey, can you help me with my story? Can you help me with my message? Can you help me use storytelling more effectively towards my goal? And I would say, yeah, of course, I have experience and I've done consulting and I've done a lot of writing. I'm happy to help you. So it really came out of people reaching out and wanting that sort of assistance, especially because, when I say underserved entrepreneurs, a lot of individuals do not have the budgets to access huge consultative organizations who have massive retainer requirements and that kind of thing. And so I provide them a bit more of an accessible approach to really refining their story and their message and getting the impacts and results they want to have based on the ideas that they're trying to share and get out into the world.
Yeah. And so I know you say you have a lot of people reaching out to you, and especially now with what's happening, when you were starting out, like, how were you getting business and clients? Because when people don't know that this is what you do and you're just starting out, like, what was your method for, did you do any outreach? Did you, what was kind of your approach there?
I love that question because I don't think we ask it enough of like, what was the sort of hustle initial steps? So my initial steps were to look on LinkedIn, excuse me, LinkedIn, and look at my mutual friends of individuals who worked in learning and development and HR specifically in certain organizations and just asking for intros to those individuals and pretty much asking them and saying, hey, what are your planning goals for the year? What are some of the pain points you're having in terms of training? I'd love to learn more and see how I could potentially help because I do public speaking in these three areas. I do training in these three areas. And so I set up a lot of phone calls and conversations with people. And it was really sort of like informational chats. So I wasn't getting on the calls and being like, buy my stuff for $9.95. You too can be trained. Like I wasn't doing any of that. It was really, how can I be of service? What can I actually help on? How can we build a relationship and connection? And because it was a warm intro, they were much more willing to have the conversation because of that. And so I was able to speak to some big brands from the beginning because of it. And then I also just applied to call for speaker applications. So organizations and conferences have a lot of those call for speaker, open call applications for potential headliners. And so I applied to a lot of those. And I tried to make sure I focused in on specific industries around leadership and human resources specifically, because those were most related to my area. And I just sent out a lot of applications. I sent at least, I would say 50 or so at the beginning, like just kind of putting them out there, putting my talks out there. And then I posted a decent amount of content around what I teach on and what I speak on. And that content would just quite like pique interest essentially, especially on LinkedIn. I had a lot of, contacts from different industries and they'd reach out and say, hey, I saw that you were speaking on this thing or you were speaking on that panel a month ago. Do you still do that? And can we talk to you? So those three things really helped a lot. But I will say some of it's just pure luck sometimes too. I think you're in the right place at the right time and someone sees you or you do a talk and that talk gets a referral later. And so I think pulling all the levers and doing a combination of outreach as well as really intensive, in-depth relationship building is super important for building any kind of business at all, especially around public speaking.
Yeah, and so and I know you say you have a good mix of them all still. Do you still do that outreach today, or has it gotten to a point where the content and the referral and being in the right place and having people see you is more taken over you having to do any more outreach?
I do it well, I'd like to stay in touch with individuals in my network because I think it's important to just maintain your relationships and stay in the know. And so I recently released a paper around narrative intelligence and sent that to a lot of people. And it was just an informational, like, hey, here's this topic, here's how it affects leadership, here's how it affects the bottom line. I think it'll be really useful to you. And from that paper itself, it became sort of a lead gen. Not necessarily that's all I wanted to get from it. I really wanted to showcase this idea to people. And so I used that to do some outreach and reach out to a ton of people and to, rehab any relationships I hadn't talked to in a while. But besides that, I'm getting a lot more inquiries than I did at the beginning. So I get a lot more inbound, and content as well has helped a lot. So that probably is happening much more than the outreach I was doing before. So we'll see how it continues to evolve. I think no matter how far you are in your business, and I have this mindset because I was in sales for a long time, you have to constantly think of how do you stay top of mind? How do you get ahead of it? And don't necessarily get comfortable or complacent because even if you have inquiries right now, you don't know what 6 months will look like from now or 12 months, what it will look like from now. So I think having some level of proactivity, even if it's a small amount, is really important to maintain.
Now, has that, I mean, I know we're going through, a different time in, most of us all having to be at home or just getting back into the workforce or still working dispersed. Has that really changed your way of working with people, or because you had that that line of sight ahead of you always in your mind about filling that pipeline, was it dispersed in the types of work as well as the different types of ways that you're getting your message out there to people?
It definitely changed me being more focused on content development. Before I felt like, oh, I can't do content. It's a waste of time, which is silly because I come from a content background, which makes no sense. I know that it can be really effective and helpful. But I felt like if I wasn't doing sales calls and trying to close deals, that, oh, my business is not going to thrive. And I think having that scarcity mindset is really hard for so many entrepreneurs, regardless if you're a public speaker or not. We're constantly grappling with fear and the what ifs. And so I think when I got out of that and just started to produce ideas that I think were useful, share ideas that I think are helpful, I actually got much more return from it than I was expecting. I really just wanted to take the time when everyone's sort of locked up inside and they're streaming the internet and they're looking for things to do to produce content that I found was actually useful and helpful. And in that process, I actually generated far more conversations than I thought possible from it. So the way that I changed my work is really focusing in on that content aspect of, I have a podcast that I produce. I do articles on LinkedIn. I've been doing some writing with some, different organizations and publications, as well as on my own site. And before, I think I was spending less time on that because I felt like, oh no, I don't think it's too indirect. It's going to take too long to get the return on it. When in fact, the more that you share your ideas and really showcase how you can solve people's problems, the more likely you'll be top of mind when people are doing research and they're thinking about who they're going to have at a potential talk or who they want to have come in and do training. So that is the biggest shift for sure. And it was funny because in Q1, because I like to plan in quarters, so I look at my work sort of in 3 month spurts essentially. And in Q1, I was like, one of the things I want to change is I want to do much more content development and ideation and thought leadership. And then it just happened because of COVID. And it just like the transition happened much more aggressively and quickly than I thought. So that's the silver lining sometimes of dramatic shifts is it forces you to get creative and have some ingenuity.
Yeah, and you brought up something interesting about, this imposter, syndrome or fear that we have that holds us back. How have you personally felt? And I'm actually halfway through writing a book about fear, so this is very interesting for me. How do you find that you kind of work through when that happens to you? When you have those voices or the whatever it is for you, that fear kind of holding you back, how do you work through that process to not let it hold you back and actually move you forward?
I love this question because I don't think we ask ourselves this enough. And a significant amount of the problems and equities that we see in the world is tied to fear. And that's something I teach in my inclusion trainings. But the thing that I do is I try to separate which of these fears are actually false narratives and which have some basis in reality, because sometimes your fears are valid and it's a way that your body's trying to figure out how to protect itself from certain risks and issues. And so making that distinction is super important, because a lot of the things that we believe are factual, immutable truths about the fears we have is just completely made up. And so I'll write, a list down and be like, girl, why are you tripping? Like, this is not a real thing. This is something you can't control, or it's something that you're just assuming. You have no idea if it's even true. And so when I get rid of all those and have counter narratives to those false fears, it allows me to kind of feel some semblance of peace around it. And then with the fears that are actually valid, I try to make plans. So if the fear is financial, I'll say, okay, well, what's my 6-month plan? Or what are my three, ABC, best case to worst case scenarios of how I'll respond to this situation. So I have a little bit of something to go off of, and I'm just not going by the seat of my pants. So I think fear is not necessarily a horrible feeling. People revere it far too much. And they also don't look at their fears and analyze them and figure out what is it trying to say to you. And I think that's a process that I integrate more and more into my work.
Wow, fascinating. I think I just need to have another conversation all about that with you.
I can talk about it for days, especially because it ties to so many things. I think the more, especially as entrepreneurs and organizations, that we can focus in on values and purpose, the more likely we will have more effective products and ideas, and not continuously build things that are inequitable and broken. And we're seeing that now with COVID. I think it's really making us have, huge self-awareness and self-evaluation and realization about how some things just don't work, and how being only focused on scarcity and fear has led us to this point.
Yeah. And if I could just jump back a little bit into our conversation, you mentioned that you were at your job for 4 years before you went out on your own, or you've been doing the speaking on the side for 4 years or 3 years, and then you've been doing it for a total of 4. But during those years of kind of having that income coming in from working for somebody versus being completely out on your own, how did that decision, how did you come to find that that was the right decision for you and that you were ready to make that jump at that time?
So one thing I thought about was, there's a lot of critiques of how people should build a business, and you should just jump and just do it, Nike style, right? And I think that is so short-sighted, because a lot of people do not have safety nets. They don't have rich parents. They don't have inheritances. I didn't have any of that. I had to completely build from literal zero, and not zero of, well, I did it on my own, but I got, a check from my uncle or a check from dad or whatever. And so I kept thinking, how can my job actually be the seed funding into my ideas? And so I used that as the structure and tried to move as much money that I was making as possible into savings, so I can have a fund essentially to float myself while I was working on my own full time, because it takes time to get leg ups. They say it takes at least 2 years to become viable. Most businesses aren't even making a profit in the first 2 years. And so that was the thinking I had, which was, how much money would I need to have in the bank to be able to survive if I didn't close one damn client for 6 months? How much would I need so I won't be on the streets? That was the kind of parameters I used. And I saved up that amount of money before I left. So I was like, once I hit this number, then I will put my 2 weeks notice in, my 3 weeks notice in, and make the jump. And I think having that in mind was really useful, because a lot of the time when people are working full time, so many people want to start their own jobs, but they don't have the steps of how to start. And so they just sort of spin their wheels for forever and they work that job for forever. You do have to jump at some point, but I did it when I had enough savings in place, enough of a foundation to understand the sort of company I wanted to build, and some starting conversations with clients. So I did all of that before I decided to leave.
Excellent. And as we get close to the end of wrapping up, if you were to go back, knowing what you know now to when you first started your business, what would you change, or what piece of advice would you give yourself, with the knowledge you have now compared to when you started?
I would say to lean into my curiosity more, and to start developing content and thought leadership earlier than I thought I needed to, because I had so much fears about doing lots of sales calls and all of that. And those are important things, but I think I spent too much time in that. And so I would definitely tell myself that. I would also say to really build relationships into these new industries earlier, because I was really making a pivot. I came from the marketing and sort of sales world, and the things I teach is really in the human resources and learning and development area. And although I have some connections there, I had to kind of start from scratch. I was building connections and relationships in an entire new industry. And if I could, the earlier you could start with that, the better always. And I think, if I had thought about it a little bit more, I probably would have spent even more time researching, reaching out, joining groups, even joining public speaking groups earlier than I did, so I could get a bit more knowledge and information and community essentially earlier.
No, that's fantastic. Well, I just want to thank you so much, Christina, for joining us. But before we leave, can you just tell everybody how they can get in touch with you, where they can find you online?
Absolutely. Yes, they can find me at my website, thenewquo.com. I talk about inclusive leadership. I do lots of writing, public speaking, podcasting. You can also find me on Instagram at Christina Blacken or at the New Quo, and then on Twitter at C Blacken.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank everybody for watching us today, and thank you, Christina, for being my guest. And if you don't know, one thing that we do after we stop this YouTube broadcast is we stay on for a couple more minutes and I ask Christina one additional question. And this content is available exclusively to our email subscribers. So if you head over to speaking.business and join our community, it doesn't cost anything. Sign up for the newsletter and you will be receiving the exclusive content that won't be available to anybody here. So thank you so much, Christina.